film coming out, hopefully, I think this year or early next year from Miyazaki. What do you think is happening with this aspect of the sort of the Japanese culture and the American culture sort of, merging into this sea of anime and manga and animation, and so rebirth in animation in a whole new way? What do you see as some of the mythological aspects of this form of animation getting, especially with kids? Why do you think it's so popular with kids?
Well, one of the things with Miyazaki is that I noticed, especially in Princess Mononoke, is that you sort of get these very archaic themes that come back. Almost the storyline of Princess Mononoke is almost medieval. I mean, it's about this town that's under threat by these astral creatures. And one of them, I think, has been injured by a cannonball, and there's iron in there, and then the whole mining operation. It's basically the same themes in Star Wars, except that it's in a more direct medieval language, and that seems to resonate more with the Japanese psyche, going back to these earlier themes. And I think, a lot of the themes in the Japanese cinema and in manga are very similar to our own, but they have this, it's almost as though they're recycling Shinto in through the back door. You get these little spirit beings peppered all throughout Miyazaki's films, these little tiny nature creatures that are always floating around, and some of them have faces that are drawn exactly like Shinto beings. And so it's a wonderful way of recycling for the modern consciousness of Japan these archaic ancestor cult themes and bringing them back in for the younger audience to relate to. Because one of the major problems in industrialized societies is once it takes on the machine and begins to industrialize, as Japan did after World War II in a big, big way, is that it threatens the culture. Industrial civilization has a tendency to disintegrate almost every society that it comes in contact with, and they tend to begin to lose their traditional culture. And so they're faced with the task of the question, how much of that do they want to preserve? How much resistance do they want to give to the machine? Islam has fought back probably in the most aggressive way so far. Japan fought back simply by taking over American culture and imitating it and giving a perfect rival. And today we're seeing the sort of revenge of Japan. You walk into a bookstore and there's aisles and aisles of these manga comic books. And they're so good at imitating American popular culture that they've become, an integral part of it. And now it's almost impossible to imagine the evolution of American culture without the Japanese contribution to it, starting with Godzilla and Astro Boy. So it's been a really amazing story there.
I think in Japan, from my experience, and I've had a little familiarity with some of the religious traditions in Japan and seeing what's changed for them over the decades since the atomic bombs were dropped in the 40s. One of the things that I see possibly as the purpose of this Japanese animation is for the modern culture to remember the rich traditions of their mythology.
Yeah.
That goes back, and really there's so much. The whole samurai culture came out of that, and
That's right.
the Age of Exploration, if anyone is familiar with James Clavell's work, like Shogun and the whole samurai tradition, which really came out of the most ancient traditions in Japan. That was a renaissance of a rebirth of the earlier cultures. But Japan itself is an extremely ancient culture. There are actually pyramids that are in Japan. Not too many people know about that. But their culture goes back and connects into the whole Pacific Island culture, which was some people refer to it as the Mu civilization, which Japan was part of this grander civilization that stretched all the way through Hawaii and the South Pacific Islands and Easter Island, and that was an island that sank in possibly 200,000 years ago when there were human beings inhabiting the Pacific, and the continents were structured differently. I find it really interesting that age of what was called the Door of Heaven with the Japanese culture, when that Door of Heaven closed, is where human beings started to lose their remembrances of their spiritual nature. And so that I think that the rebirth of this manga and the anime is people attempting to reach back in their own archaic memory and sort of pull that forward into a modern context.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And that whole culture sphere that you just drew is sort of on a map there in the Pacific Basin, and you could also include China in this to a large degree, and then you could also draw it back down and include a lot of the societies of equatorial Africa. Actually constitutes a single culture zone that's known as the ancestral culture zone, in which the cult of the ancestors is the primary religion, common to all of those societies, and they all have a similar emphasis in their art. If you look at the artwork on the head, and on representations of large, long, elongated heads with small bodies, and you get in that region the distribution of what's called the bent-kneed motif, where the figures will have slightly bent knees or they'll be squatting. But the emphasis is always on the head, as it is, for example, on Easter Island, where you see these giant, head
and there's
statues.
A lot of that predominantly in South American culture.
And then that culture extends into the Mesoamerican civilization right at the start with the Olmecs, and these gigantic carved heads. And the thing about the ancestral civilization, and it's completely the opposite of our Western civilization, is that all respect and reverence in the society is given to the past. The ancestors had the original collection of mythic culture forms, and they don't need to be changed. They don't need to be tampered with, and there's a very strong sense of taboo within these societies that discourages change and innovation. I think, by the way, that this was the dimension that was missing from Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, when he tried to explain about why the West became the way it did and why these other societies languished behind. And he gives what to me is a very superficial explanation, where he says that it's because the West emerged out of the Middle East, and it had the highest concentration of domesticable crops, and it had all these animals, the pigs, goats, sheep, that could be domesticated. And it had access to all these goods that, just gave it this technological impetus that enabled it to master all of these things, whereas these other poor societies, Africa, doesn't have, you can't domesticate the zebra, and the New World had only the llama. And so it's a very superficial answer. What he should have been looking at is the religion, and he would have found that the reason why change didn't happen in these societies is because they're ancestor cult-based societies that forbid change, don't like it, and they realize that when you tamper with archetypal forms, it disturbs the entire society. It causes a ripple effect that creates social problems and chaos, as we ourselves are finding out. And they know this. And so you're going to get probably in the manga, I don't know because I haven't read enough of the manga to really know this, but I imagine that a lot of the deeper messages are going to be very different from our civilization that values change, the novel, and the youth. We look toward the future, and our departure point is really, the Virgin Mary with the baby on her lap. We've put the baby up. The infant Christ is the primary image, not the wise old man ancestor. It's the baby because the baby is the future. And so, and America has taken that over from Europe to this sort of almost infantile, this worship of the child, the wonder child, the miracle working wonder child.
Happens every year at this time.
Yeah, because the new generation has the new sets of ideas.
Right.
And so our orientation is completely different from Japan or any of these ancestor cult societies that discourage individual initiative and innovation. And so we're making a mess out of the world, but we're also having a big, fun time doing it with all these new gadgets and devices and so on. So it's a big clash. And, the clash with Islam brings this to a focus because they have a very similar orientation to these ancestor cult societies. So there's a real struggle going on.
Yeah, let's go into that a little bit. It's something I normally don't get into in this program, but you bring it up, and the whole Muslim religion happening in the world right now, and there's so much opposition to that in the West here in the U.S. because of course, this mindset that, we think that they're terrorists and they're going to attack us any minute. But the culture itself coming from, this one person who was enlightened, who started to spread this, how does something like that become what we have today? The Muslim culture or the religion itself, why do you think it has taken on the role that it has in today's world from the mythological perspective, not from the social or political aspect?
To be superficial about it, I could say, well, somebody has to stand up for the old ways. I mean, we can't just, have this global takeover of the planet by, Western technocratic civilization and have everybody just, accept it. I mean, that's how realistic is that we would expect that to take place. These civilizations are extremely old, extremely conservative, extremely archaic, and they don't like things messed with, The thing that they're tacitly recognizing and standing up for is that it brings about social chaos. Alcoholism, drug abuse, gangs, all these things are functions of technocratic interferences, technological, I should say, interferences in society. Every new gadget that is introduced in society creates social ripples that disrupts the society and to which the society has then to adapt. But in our case, we don't give people time to adapt to the new changes. We just throw another gadget on top of those changes,